getting into the next session, which is our panel on equity. And we have with us for that panel three distinguished speakers. One of our speakers today is Professor Rosalind Malcolm. Professor Malcolm is a professor of law at the University of Surrey, where she also acts as director of the environmental regulatories through which law can be used to protect the environment. Her recent work is on the wicked problem of polluting waste from plastics and how a circular economy might help to stop the problem of waste. Through her presentation, which is focused on, it's a keynote and it brings together all the key issues on this issue of equity in addressing plastic pollution. So over to you, Professor Malcolm. Welcome and thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, Petty, and thank you so much for inviting me to the symposium on World Environment Day. And I would like to say how much I enjoyed the poem, which I think had a wonderful grounding effect for us and put very into context the comments that I will be making for sure. So, as I say, thank you so much for inviting me here today to speak. And because it's a very auspicious time with us moving towards a global plastic treaty, with the second negotiations ending last week, and perhaps some progress having been made. I'm going to focus on three different areas in my talk. Firstly, how can we eliminate waste? And I put waste in quotation marks. I'm thinking of it as a concept, something that we need to remove as a word in the language, that we will say in future, what was this thing that they had in the 2020s that was called waste, so that we move to eliminate it as a function of society. And then secondly, I speak as a lawyer. So my interest is looking at the legal tools that need to be designed to prevent waste. And of course, we're talking very much about plastics waste here and the pollution from plastics. And how do we design legal tools that will stimulate an economy where plastics are retained within that? They become part of the stock assets of that economy. And then thirdly, how can we influence policymakers to implement those legal tools? I'm, as well as being a professor at the University of Surrey, I'm co-director of the Governing Plastics Network, and I co-direct with Professor Nicholas Aguge, who you're going to hear from a little bit later this morning. The Governing Plastics Network is run jointly between the University of Surrey and the University of Nairobi. And there are some links available. I do encourage everybody to join the Governing Plastics Network. We have a lot of material there about the projects that we've been working on, videos and policy briefs and blogs that we run on a weekly basis. So please do join. So designing law then to prevent the ecological harm caused by plastics waste. How do we go about that? And one of the key points to be made is the need to move from issues around liability to prevention. As a lawyer, people tend to come to me when there's a problem. We are problem solvers. And yet for dealing with ecological harm, it's no good waiting for the harm to occur. As lawyers, we need to be thinking about the necessary tools to prevent that waste and to eliminate the waste as a concept. So from liability to prevention, I don't need to show you images, which I did have on my slides, of the horrors that harm causes, the damage to animals, ecosystems, and to us as human beings as well. There is no question in my mind that the core of a legal framework for dealing with the problem of plastics is to move from worrying about liability for who did it to prevention, to stop it happening in the first place. A simple rule, but a complex one at the same time. So moving to that concept where we focus not on the waste, the flows of things through our economy, but where we focus on retaining materials. I don't need to tell you that at the moment, our laws are based on an industrial linear economy, We take, we make, we throw away. We're very familiar with that concept. It's a flat line economy where we take resources from the earth, we make things with them, and then when we're finished with those, we throw them away. And what we need to do is to replace those material and energy flows by holding on to material stocks of assets, where waste becomes an input, not a thing that you throw away, but a vital resource that you need. And of course, here is where the concept of waste changes. This is not something that we are discarding or that we don't want or that is unattractive or hostile. It's a valuable resource. It acquires a new meaning. It's there to be as an input into our economy. So how do we get to that point where the plastic product sits within our economy and doesn't leave it and leak into the environment? Well, we need to think about life cycles. We need to think about the whole life cycle of a product. We need to look at the beginning of the life of a product to the very end of the life of the product in our current linear economy. We have to identify the various points around that life cycle where we are in danger of losing the material into the environment. And then when we've identified those points, those key points in that life cycle, we have to think, how do we use the law to achieve that? And this is something that is, I think, better described as a performance economy, where we retain stocks in that economy. That's the core of it, in that circularity of it, where we provide services rather than sell goods, where we reuse materials and products, where we remanufacture products. And we're talking about extending the service life of products rather than intensifying the flow of materials through the economy. And of course, such an approach requires labour. It requires us to put our labour into the product rather than using energy or using virgin materials. In a linear economy, the economic and business models that we have at the moment focus on the flows, GDP, added value, rather than prioritizing the quality, value, and use of stock. We talk about growth in the economy where we make and sell things. And of course, where we keep making and selling things, then apparently we are growing better for our linear economy. But it's not good for the environment. And we need to focus on ensuring that our labour is input to retain those stocks of materials within the economy rather than letting them leak out. Of course, such an approach needs a complete rethink of public policy. And the approach needs to range across the human side to the technical side. All our speakers so far, and in that wonderful poem, talked about humanity in this, the human rights issue, the human contribution. There's often a feeling that we can solve our problems through technology. Well, technology is part of it, of course. We need to be building our technical approaches so that we can reuse, remanufacture. But alongside that, in our public policy rethink, we need to have at the heart of it social welfare, employment rights, and the sustainability, thinking about our children and our grandchildren, as well as ourselves in every country in the world. If you take the life cycle of the plastic products, we can see that where we go from the extraction of the natural resources, leading round that line to the disposal, we need to be bringing those 2 points together to make sure that the product circulates round. And I talked earlier about the key points in that life cycle. We need to identify where we are at danger of losing things, allowing the product to move along that chain. Points where one person, the bottle is empty, the product is used, the bottle is empty. We need to look at ways in which legal tools can trigger the reuse of that bottle. If we can't just reuse it as it stands, then we need to look at ways in which we can repair it. And the right to repair, a very major growing area of campaigning at the moment. So those points need to be identified in the life cycle. Of course, I mentioned at the beginning, we are reaching the We are at the end of the second set of negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty. This is something where the world is engaged in this question. And these are highly pertinent questions about how we manage that life cycle of the plastic product and how we focus on different aspects. Different questions arise in different parts of the world. And yet this problem is the same. There is a similarity, a likeness across all the issues across the world, that we need to stop that product escaping into the environment. We need to prevent the production of waste and drive towards a retention of those materials using whatever tools we can. And I focus as a lawyer on the law. So what do we need to do to move towards a global plastics treaty? Well, for my part, my role in it is to identify and evaluate those legal tools for the management of plastics and their waste, which are most effective in stimulating an economy where plastics are retained as stocks rather than wasted. And then, and it's a big then, we have to implement and enforce them. And I think it's important to keep in mind all the time our end point. What is it? Where are we trying to get to with this? And my answer to that is we're trying to live well within a finite planet. That's my talk. I thank you very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Malcolm. That was quite inspiring. And of course, being a lawyer myself, I felt really excited hearing you speak about not just the law-based prevention, but talking about how technology fits into all of this. Because sometimes we get carried away by one solution as against the other, whereas we should actually be thinking about how to bring everything together and foster a complementarity between the various tools. So thank you very much for that. And for the
Thank
efforts
you.
on the ground as well with the advocacy. So that's very, very inspiring. And I'd encourage everyone, we've seen the links shared by Professor Malcolm to get involved in this and lend our voices and our support to the movement as well. Thank you. I have a few questions already for you. And to start with, I was just wondering, given your expertise in environmental law and policy, of course, what do you believe are the key challenges that we face in achieving sustainable development and protecting the environment in the current global scenario?
Well, I focus on one thing, and I focused on it in my talk. I mean, there are many different, this is a wicked problem. There are many different elements to this problem, and people need to address it from many different disciplinary backgrounds. My perspective and my focus is on the elimination of waste. And by that I mean, as I described in my talk, eliminating waste as a concept. Of course, we will have products that reach the end of their natural life or which people discard, but it's about changing the laws so that those products are held. We hold on to them. We don't lose those valuable resources. We need that we will stop um, extracting natural resources from the earth. We are on a finite planet. We can't keep taking without thought for the future. And that seems to me the management of our waste. And you may notice that I didn't mention recycling as an element in my talk. Of course, we may need to recycle products, but it seems to me that a key challenge is not just to stop using landfill or to throw things in the gutter. It's also to stop seeing recycling as a core solution to the problem. Recycling is complex. It's environmentally damaging in itself, and we need to, certainly it would be at the a solution for the future, but it's, I think, almost at the point of disposal, that it's very much down the chain. It's about moving upstream in terms of facing those challenges and keeping products in the economy, and not moving through those different parts of the value chain.
Thank you very much for that. And just wondering, in your research on climate change and human rights, and of course, environmental law. Have you come across any innovative approaches that could actually be successful or seen as successful case studies where environmental protection and human rights have been effectively integrated as a way of addressing plastic pollution problem?
That's a really interesting question, and of course, much of my work with Professor Nicholas Aguge has brought me into contact with youth groups in Kenya who are just amazing. They are inspirational, and they bring that inspiration, that passion to bear in respect of collecting plastics, sorting plastics. Um, their anger at what we're doing to the planet is infectious. You just have to admire and wish to emulate the work that those young people are doing. So there are a number of
Mm.
youth groups in Kenya that I've come across who are inspirational. And then, of course, there are the campaigners who come into this scenario from their perspective. So people like James Wakibia, the photojournalist, who runs a campaign, and focuses on the problems of plastic, demonstrates through his brilliant photography and his brilliant campaigning the sort of problems that you have. And one of our projects looked at the way in which those powerful campaigns influence the outcoming policy and governance approaches, that they have an impact. And one of the things that we've been looking at and addressing is how to capture some of that knowledge from people like James Wakibia. And I could mention, Sir David Attenborough, who with his fantastic programs and his piece in his series Blue Planet, talked for about 2 minutes on the problem of plastics and generated in my country a whole, development of policy, a whole raft of policy. How do we capture those inspirational campaigners? How do we bottle that passion and turn it into the rather dry laws and the enforcement approaches that need to come in order to capture that and enforce it? I mean, human rights issues, of course, within the economy that I've talked about, where we have a service economy, where we are talking about the human input to products, to repair them, to keep them in the chain, there we need to focus very much on social welfare, employment rights, human rights. This is a human, this is an anthropogenic situation that we're in, and we need to be able to focus that those elements as well.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we have a question from the audience. So we'll just read that question out to you as well, Professor Malcolm. Waste management has been a problem for underdeveloped and developing countries. What measures will you deploy to salvage this problem, ma'am? So
Thank you for that question. It's a fabulous question. It is such a big question, and don't assume that in the developing world that there is not a waste management problem too. There's no panacea anywhere to find for this, and it seems to me that I could talk to you about technical measures, about using recycling techniques, using repair, and the whole right to repair campaign, I think is really important, and that has its complexities as well. Looking at how you are going to manage the intellectual property rights of manufacturers that don't allow access to the specifications for products, so making it difficult to do those repairs. Getting a new battery in your phone may require some knowledge and some requirement to get those specifications. So there's those sorts of issues that I think are really important. And of course, in the underdeveloped and the developing countries, we've got problems where we have waste pickers who may well be operating in unsafe circumstances. So the social welfare, the employment rights, the human rights element, I think, is as important to think about in an economy where you're actually harnessing those incredible skills that those people have. And I think one of the concerns about the negotiations for the Global Plastics Treaty is the question: are we hearing from? Are we bringing these skills in? Are we only hearing from the mega companies, the big corporations, or are we actually listening to the knowledge, skills, and taking that on board of the people in these countries who've got incredible knowledge about the problem? They know exactly what's there. They know exactly the problems of sorting the waste and managing that aspect of it. Are we bringing those skills in? So I think my answer to your question is, of course, there are technical and legal sides to it, but it seems to me that the human side is just as important in dealing with this problem.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Malcolm. We have another question. Thinking about making laws that will ensure that people reuse or reduce the use of plastics, don't you think this might affect people's human rights?
Which one? I have a right to an environment, and I think that the mismanagement of this really valuable material. I mean, plastics is an incredible material. It's why it's everywhere now, because of the brilliance of this material. But the way that we are using this material is damaging the environment. And that's my human right, your human right, our human right to the environment, the right of the environment, the rights of aspects of the environment. The notion that the environment has rights as well. I think these are really overwhelmingly important rights that we need to address. And if it means reusing, reducing, so be it.
Thank you very much, Professor Malcolm. And I think that also speaks to the issue of the complexity of human rights and the fact that you always have different rights, but they don't always align nicely with each other. So sometimes there's a balancing that has to occur. We have to think about the ways in which one right affects the other. And then when we think about plastics, perhaps one thing to consider is plastics are a means to an end, right? And not just an end in themselves. So perhaps people who rely on plastics, maybe for livelihoods, because I see in the comments people say people rely on this for waste picking, waste sorting. Yes. So do we want to think about a transition away from plastics that is just for people who are still reliant on it so that they have sustainable alternatives? So it's not a case of stop it at the cost of the people who depend on it, but it is a case of stop it and support those who depend on it to have sustainable livelihoods outside of their reliance on plastics. So that's something we need to think about as well. I think the last one for you, Professor Malcolm, for now at least, and then we can let you have a break because we have lots of people enjoying this keynotes and lots of comments, lots of questions, lots of suggestions. Thanks everyone for engaging. So I would say this, Professor Malcolm, how do you think we can motivate people and communities to take real action in support of environment and sustainability?
Yes, yes, that's the knowledge and awareness. I'm an educator as well as a lawyer, and when I listen to the youth groups in Kenya, they said, well, we didn't. Was one young woman in particular was really quite powerful. She said, I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know that there were different types of plastics. I didn't know that you could do this or that, and the solutions to it. And she said, but I learned about it. I heard about it. And it seems to me that it's about communication. It's about education. It's building awareness and then taking that on, then using that to influence policy, to bring pressure to bear on our policymakers. The more people are aware of the problem, the more they understand the problem. Awareness is one thing, but understanding the problem is another thing. And I think as educators, those of us who are educators must really address that question about making sure people understand the problem, they are aware of it, and to build that passion, to use those campaigners, to get that message, to bottle that passion and pass it on.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Malcolm.